I'm more in favour of adversary. I play rugby. And I actually think the fundamental reason why we have the EU was because people didn't stand up to extremism in the 30s. And I actually think that the British system, by having tough negotiations, I cut my teeth working for AMEC in the construction industry. And there's nothing more adversary than working in groundworks in the Liverpool docks, I can assure you. And it's character forming. And I think it's very important that you actually have adversarial discussions, because at the end of the day in Britain, we have the ability to shake our hands with someone you've had a disagreement with, a boxing ring or a rugby match, and then agree to work together. And it's very important that I think arguments are, in effect, tested to destruction, because otherwise you get this sort of slow accretion of people with power, and their arguments aren't tested. And I would like to point out that if we look at the meat scandals that happened, the closure of local abattoirs, and I grew up in the countryside, where in effect an abattoir served the local parishes, and the butcher would actually choose the animal to sell and then send it to the local abattoir, was a very effective way of stopping criminal gangs being involved. And I would point out a 20-ton lorry selling meat on the black market at £5 a kilo, it's £100,000. And I actually believe, and certainly growing up in the countryside, a lot of the damage to subsidising farmers with pesticides, with fertilisers, and over drainage has actually caused a lot of the environmental problems we're now having to solve.
It's a very interesting question. There is a completely coherent Green argument for Brexit, and we are seeing some people in the Green Party start to make that case. Michael Liebrich, one of our foremost advocates of clean energy, is a fierce advocate of Brexit, arguing, why can't we as a sovereign nation put strong environmental standards in ourselves? Are we cowering behind Brussels because we can't push this agenda forward ourselves? Laura, that's an argument you must have heard. What would be your response?
Yes, I mean, in the sense that, but it depends what sort of vision you think about this country. I don't think that anybody is proposing Brexit to so that we can impose higher environmental standards. I think Brexit is the options. I mean, I have three versions. One is called The Twilight Zone by John Redwood and Owen Paterson, and that's the Norwegian Swiss option. We have The Brave New World by Douglas Carswell, which is Let's Be Singapore. And then we have Back to the Past by Nigel Farage. I don't think any of them have mentioned the word green in any of their proposals. So I don't see that it's going to necessarily, it certainly won't be at the high point. We will have to improve our productivity and our so-called aggressive competitiveness in a way that will have to meet a shortfall that we will find about leaving the single market. And it's not doom and gloom. I mean, you know, we can survive outside. That's no problem. But we will have to transform into a more economic rather than social sort of structure, and I think that those are the areas that will get the most sort of squeezed. Could I just answer the abattoir question? Because the abattoir directive, or the whatever it was, I don't know what the directive was, but it was about clean abattoirs, and the EU designated that all abattoirs should be as clean as possible. Right? In France, I think they closed down 15% of their abattoirs. In the UK, I think we closed down 82% of our abattoirs. Same directive, different gold plating, different enforcement. And what happened was that the UK government, I mean, whether good or bad, the UK government decided that they had to designate, through technical research, etc., the most hygienic abattoir that could possibly be created, and that became the standard. So sometimes we are the gold platers. We're actually exceeding some of the requirements of Europe.
Just if it's very brief, just I appreciate the desire of an adversarial system, but
as a consequence of moving around meat, I was talking with a chap who worked on a landfill in West London, and after the BSE problem, he saw criminals break into landfills and excavate cattle that had been buried in landfill. and then put into the meat chain. And this was possible because being able to move meat through the whole of Europe.
And then we have enforcement issues with that as well. Where's the funding for the enforcement? Is one of the other key concerns here that we'll be talking about this afternoon. Gentleman down the front who's been waiting patiently.
Laura, you say this country's had quite a diet of anti-EU media, and not many people standing up. As we're at the EIC conference, so what advice would you and Matthew give to Matthew and the team at EIC to really, I suppose, take this opportunity to influence and put the environment on the agenda, either of the debate or the negotiations over a future of EU? What advice would you give Matthew?
I mean, I think this is a very, very important organisation to be there as a voice to say that many businesses, many European leading businesses are in this room, and that it's absolutely crucial for you that there is, first of all, absolute free and easy access to a single market. As I say, services single market will be even more exciting for some of your companies, but that also European legislation has framed your investment models and has framed and shaped the way you have built your businesses. And all of you in this room employ people. And that is absolutely crucial, that politicians understand exactly the scale of this sector and how deep this sector goes right across the country. I would also urge anybody who wants to talk about their exposure to or their risk is that the way it's framed is quite important in terms of framing it around where your staff actually work, not your head office. The public are not interested in jobs being lost in London, I can assure you that. It is absolutely about location, proximity to me. It is about the small firm in Loughborough. It's not about Deutsche Bank in London.
Every organisation has to make its own choices. I think there are 3 levels of intervention I can imagine, and I'm going through with my own trustees. The first is to make sure that the debate is informed, so we have some evidence in the debate, and I've tried to provide a little bit of that today, and many others I think will play that role. I'm sure EIC will, as a matter of course. The second is to make sure that the environment is part of the debate. That's a higher level of engagement, and it would be, I mean, given what Matthew said in his introduction about the environment not being a particularly big issue in politics in the UK at the moment, I think it is an opportunity to try and get both sides to debate the UK's environmental vision. And lastly, do you want to promote a particular way of voting? I'm very carefully not doing that, but some organisations will choose to do that.
I'm looking down the list of delegates, the only one with finance against his name. I'm an infrastructure banker by background. 2 points. There's no doubt about it that people today are prepared to pay more and spend more on environmental type initiatives and projects than they were 20 years ago. But if you look at the ministry responsible, DEFRA, over half its budget is taken up with the Common Agricultural Policy. A huge chunk goes to fisheries. Relatively little actually goes to environment. We need to have one ministry for environment. That is a start, whether we're in or out. The second thing is there's been a lot of discussion about exports and the threat to exports about a Brexit. A couple of years ago, I did a study on the offshore wind market as to who had actually won the contracts. Out of about 12 to 14 billion pounds worth of contracts, which represent about 120 contracts, only 2 or 3 went to UK-owned and controlled companies. On the super sewer, which we can argue about later as to whether it's a good thing or not, of the companies who pre-qualified for that, there were, out of 17 companies, 15 were only UK, 15 were non-UK, only 2 were UK-owned and controlled. If we are outside the common market, outside the European Union, we would be able to take charge of our own procurement policies, and therefore we could help to rebuild some of our industrial base.
It's an interesting point. Brexit could envisage a more proactive state that could start to nurture and tackle some of these issues. It's that argument again that there is a green case for Brexit. Laura, would you?
Yeah.
Want to come back?
I mean, I don't disagree with you about an environment department. I think the environment sort of permeates in a strange way. You almost want either an environment department or no environment department, and every department having to have a very clear environmental sort of, in many ways, theme right the way through it, because actually it permeates right across all government departments and its impact. I mean, as I say, I don't think coming out of Europe is going to, we're going to absolutely fall apart. I would say to you, though, and I was very upset because as I say, I used to represent this constituency where London Array was the largest wind farm in the world. And there weren't the skills in the UK to actually take up some of those jobs, and it was absolute shocking. It was shocking, and I totally agree with you. But it wouldn't have been built if we'd had to only procure locally, because we just didn't have the skills. I'd also say I was at the French Embassy yesterday, and they say that their second largest city, well, we know that I think London is their third largest city, but their second largest city for employment, and that is not of French people, that is through French companies, is London. If you look at all these big companies, particularly in the infrastructure sector, who might not be UK based, they are employing UK staff. And we have always had, and probably always would have, a much more open ownership approach than actually any other European country has to date. And if we came out, I don't see that that would change in many ways. If you look at the Carswell sort of vision, we would be absolutely open for business, and all our businesses would be open to be bought.
Just interestingly, on the offshore wind farm point about there not being that domestic content, you're absolutely right. The first wave of projects was very much dominated by, to a shocking extent actually, by foreign companies. This week we ran a story from Renewable UK, so it is the industry trade body, so you can maybe want to take it with a pinch of salt, but they looked at the level of domestic content in the new offshore wind farms that are being built, and it has increased drastically, and they say they're very close to a target of 50% domestic content. It's not around the big companies that own the stuff, and we can talk for a long time about the failure of British businesses to deliver competitors with the big utilities, but in terms of a lot of the services, the cabling, the sea support, the operations and maintenance, those are British-owned companies that are benefiting, which is what Renewable UK have been saying. One thing we haven't touched on at all is we've been talking a lot about exit from the EU, but we don't know what the EU that we'll be exiting from will look like, and the Prime Minister remains confident. Some would say it's misplaced confidence, but he remains confident that he will get some reforms pushed through that will benefit the UK and will allow him to campaign for us to stay in. On the environmental front, are there any reforms that could really help and make it an easier sell that in this sphere? Are there things that could be improved? I know Matthew touched on them. Are there any others that you see where maybe the Prime Minister should be saying, they're not on his top list of priorities, we've seen his top list of priorities, but underneath that, should we be using this as an opportunity to get some progress on common agricultural policy in other areas?
We should, but we won't, because the politics are so polarised already around the negotiation. I mean, the good news is that watering down EU directives is not part of the Prime Minister's negotiating strategy, although I have to say the UK has not been one of the champions of the nature directives which are currently being reviewed, so there's significant unhappiness from the nature conservation organisations about the UK's position on that. Nevertheless, it's not part of the negotiations. If I could make them so, I would encourage the UK to champion the circular economy package, which is due out on December the 2nd, but then we'll have at least a year of negotiation around the specifics of how we improve the quality of recyclate, how we improve the standards of collection recovery, repairability and reuse in the EU, because I think that will be massively helpful to unleash demand and to allow new business models around resource recovery and capture to emerge. I'd also put CAP reform on the list, although, to be honest, that is such a Herculean job. It takes place every 7 years. The next cycle starts in 2016, and I hope the UK will will be one of the actors pushing hard for CAP to be fundamentally reformed so that it no longer incentivises overproduction.
I think there's something slightly unreal about the description of what Britain outside of Europe might look like, in that people tend to assume there'd be no remaining regulation coming from Europe. There'd be no, our hands would no longer be tied when it comes to the government acting as it wishes. That's simply unreal, because what would happen straight away is that the UK government would have to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU. And the idea that you could just abolish public procurement rules and that the other, the 27 member states would be happy with that is just absurd. Why would Germany accept a free trade agreement with Britain if Britain could somehow select only British suppliers for its public contracts? I think that's extremely unlikely. It's also incompatible with the TTIP proposals which are coming through and which are backed strongly by this government. There's a similar issue around environmental directives, many of which are actually under the free trade aspects of the Treaty of Rome. So the environment hasn't simply been protected as an environmental measure, it's been protected to achieve a level playing field. So if you want a free trade agreement with Europe, you're going to have to follow a lot of the environmental rules that already exist. I think it's important that those aspects are brought into the debate, because Douglas Carswell's view of the future is unlikely to prevail.
Fascinating point. If we did Brexit, could we, as environmental groups, actually protect a lot of this because of that free trade requirement? I mean, it's not...
Yes, I mean, if we ended up with the Norway-Switzerland option, we have to comply. If we want to participate as part of the single market, we have to pay money for it. We have to comply with all regulations, and it's called, sort of laws by fax, very old-fashioned. But so Norway just receives information about what its businesses will need to do if they want to access the single market. And many Norwegian companies have actually bought Swedish and Danish companies so that they can sit around the table and have a say. So the perverseness of it. So in many ways, it's the worst of all worlds. No say, having to follow the regulation, and companies, like people in this room, being kept out of the room when the rules are being set.
Matthew, sorry.
Well, I don't think Brits would have much of a say, whether they're environmentalists or not, over what the European Union did once we left, which was my point. We just ceased to have any influence. We would still be covered by most of the regulation, old and new, but I think there would be a big question about how strongly applied that regulation would be. Even based on the Norwegian experience, they're much slower at adopting European legislation than anyone within the European Union. So I think that will become much more problematic.
Is the risk, though, that Brexit opens up the next avenue of attack? That many of the groups that are supporting it would then say, why have we got the Climate Change Act? Why are we having Brussels tell us this when we're not even part of it? And you then have yet another round of very big arguments over the future of these regulations.
I mean, I think it's not beyond Matthew or myself or probably anyone in this room to see there's a conflation of people who want Brexit and people who also would like to repeal the Climate Change Act. So there is a sort of fundamental theme running through both of those. And I mean, the Climate Change Act is based, in my very strong view, on deep science. But there is a sort of libertarian streak to all of this. And as a result, I would say very much that environmental legislation would be very much up for grabs, but also so would social legislation.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much to our panellists, and thanks to everyone for all those questions.